We hear it all the time. Environmental protection costs money. Native plants and prairie grasses are beautiful, but they're a pain in the butterfly. Or are they?
Yeah, well, there's a study that has shown that the installation and management of native species, grasses, flowers, costs 40 to 50% less for the installation part of it and for the management part of it, as you know, in perpetuity, because there's less inputs that have to go in. There's no fertilizer required. There's some periodic maintenance, weed control, but it's not just wholesale broadcasting of chemicals onto this. And there's no, mowing every week that's going to be burning fossil fuels and contributing to noise pollution and all that.
This is Dave Nye, who I met at the Wild Things conference in Chicago last week, where he and his associate, Joe Krischon, had just spent 5 years restoring a bluff and ravine north of the city, on the shores of Lake Michigan, where an army base called Fort Sheridan used to be. It dated back to the 1860s, the U.S. Civil War, and it closed in the 1990s. For over 125 years, the Army and others had been dumping garbage into the ravine, killing native plants and letting invasive species take over, which ended up disrupting the flow of bugs and birds across the entire region. And that had consequences that we'll be exploring today. To fix the mess, Dave and Joe and his colleagues had to rip out all of the invasive trees and shrubs, then bring the natives back to life. And then they burned those resurrected natives, for reasons we'll get into later. But why are native plants so important?
With natives, you get all those ecosystem services, too, of the stormwater retention and the pollinator habitat, wildlife habitat. It's healthier for people, more enjoyable for people. Kids learn more when they're exposed to environments like that. I mean, there's all kinds of studies out there.
Pollinators, as in bees. I'm sure you've heard about the plunging population of bees and how this can cost farmers trillions of dollars. It turns out honeybees are only a small part of the equation. Nye calls them livestock. There are hundreds of species of native bees, butterflies, and other pollinators, insects that spread pollen among plants and help them reproduce. These pollinators, it turns out, depend on native plants. When the native plants go, the bees and butterflies go, and large swaths of our countryside and our rural economy go with them.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Earth, we broke it, we own it. And nothing is as it was. Not the bees, not the seas, not the forests, farms, or fields, and not the global economy that depends on all of these. But we can restore it, make it better, greener, more resilient, more sustainable. But how? Technology? Geoengineering? Are we doomed to live on a bionic planet, or is nature herself the answer? That's the question we address in every episode of Bionic Planet, a podcast of the Anthropocene, the new epoch defined by man's impact on Earth. And today we hear how the destruction of native plants has fueled the plunge in pollinator species and what the backbreaking restoration of a single ravine tells us about the restoration economy.
Hi, I'm Joe Krischon with Conservation Land Stewardship. I'm a project manager.
Dave Nye with Conservation Land Stewardship. I'm project developer.
So you're on the business side and you're digging in the dirt kind of stuff. Okay, yeah. This was a really fascinating presentation you just gave. I never really thought of how much work goes into restoring a bluff. Can you talk a little bit about what you found when you got there and how you approached it?
The first step, is usually you're going to want to get the invasive woodies out of the way so you have a matrix to work in. And also you can expose any other kind of issues that might have been on site that were concealed. Typically like you get the underbrush out and then maybe that's like your phase 1 clearing. And then you can come in and do the larger clearing that we had specifications coming in. And then we'll do the larger tree clearing. But that'll open up a plane where you can see the following growing season, what invasives are there, what areas don't need as much attention, what do. So that that's the first step, definitely, is getting the woody material out, but also doing it in a way that you're not going to cause additional problems, in heavily sloped zones. That's another thing you have to work with, the team, talk to the engineers on your team, the landowners, and also make sure you're not going to, cause any more harm in terms of erosion.
Right, because if you peel off the plants, you've got a naked hill, big wave comes in, it takes it all away, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the root systems are still going to be in place, but those plants are effectively dead once you cut and herbicide the stumps. So I wouldn't count on them to hold up for much more than a year or so. And you got to think about rainfall and how that might affect the ground soils, surface soils.
And then where does the burning come in?
So the burning will come in a little later. Typically, once you get a nice native matrix established that'll carry fire, then you want to come in and burn it. Usually, we like to say like 3 years after is usually ideal. You can sometimes do it sooner. A situation like some of the remnant communities I was discussing, those have a little bit more of a native matrix to start, and you can maybe burn those a little earlier. But once you get a nice enough, thick enough matrix that'll carry fire consistently through, then you can execute the burn. So usually 2 to 3 years, I'd say, is average.
Okay, that's really interesting as a layman, because I thought you would come in and burn first. You come in and you physically clear out the invasive species, then you plant the natives, then you burn them. Okay, why in that sequence?
So yeah, what it does, it helps deplete the seed bank of weed seed. So if you're burning in an area that you're establishing, it's going to subdue a lot of cool season weeds that are real green during time of burning. It's going to set those back and allow natives to flourish a little better. It also helps to germinate a lot of native species, especially some more rare species they're finding actually germinate better when they're exposed to fire and charcoal and so forth. And also it tips nutrient balance to make it the soil more beneficial for native plants.
Joe and I later got to talking about books, and it turns out that one of our mutual favorites is 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus by Charles C. Mann. In actual fact, I never read the book, but listened to the audiobook, which is excellent. I got it through audible.com, and you can get it too for free and help me produce more episodes of Bionic Planet by getting a 30-day trial to Audible through audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet. That's Bionic Planet as a single word with no dots, dashes, or spaces. If you're already a member of Audible but like the work I'm doing and want to help me do more of it, you can give me a good 5-star review on whichever podcatcher you access me through. Or you can become a patron at bionic-planet.com, where you can support me for as little as $1 per episode and with a monthly cap. You can do so either via bionic-planet.com or via patreon.com/bionicplanet. Finally, you can help just by accessing me through the right podcatcher. Namely, access me through the Radio Public app. That's Radio Public, like public radio, but backwards. They automatically pay me a few cents for every listener who hears the show all the way to the end, and that adds up. And it also struck me what a complex mosaic of plants you have. You can't just, drop a bunch of seeds and see what sticks. You talked about going in and scouting the terrain and seeing what can go where. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so especially in the ravine habitats, you're dealing with a lot of sloping, a lot of different sun exposures, different water exposures. So, you really have to be sure that what you're planting where is going to work. And that's why in a lot of the more complex zones, I would recommend, doing plugging, actually physically putting a plant plug in as opposed to seeding. Also because in those sloped areas, a lot of the seed can wash off in a storm event, right? So plugging is essential, but it can also be more expensive. So the seeding is done still. Areas where you can, I'd recommend erosion control, like blanketing, but that's not really cost effective over a huge area. But where it is, and if you're doing a smaller ravine, I'd highly recommend blanketing it when you seed. So it's just erosion protection blanketing. It's just armoring. I would recommend like a biodegradable one that's going to break down over the next few years. Get a biodegradable blanket so that you don't have plastic netting in your habitat for perpetuity.
You mentioned that I think the term you used was flatlanders, right? So that's where you have done the bulk of your work, and now you're moving into ravines. What are the biggest surprises you found in going from that relatively simple landscape into something like this?
The thing that jumps out to me most is just the crew. Restoration work is physical regardless, but when you go ahead and you transpose it onto slopes and 200 plus feet sloped areas, it's that much more demanding, and it can be daunting. So it's really important to have goals set and goals in mind. You don't just want to go out there aimlessly. You want to have concise goals that you want to accomplish. Otherwise, you're going to get overwhelmed.
And then, because you have so many diverse plants, you have to have a diverse crew, right? I mean, these guys have to have lots of different skill sets. Can you talk about the diversity of skill sets that you need to go along with the diversity of plants that you're working with?
Yeah, definitely. Plant identification is probably one of the most important skills to have working in complexes like this. You want to have site managers or crew leaders or foremen. You want to have them acclimated or at least familiarized with different habitats, including dune, prairie, wetland, and even beyond that, there's plants that are just unique to these habitats that you wouldn't find around here. You'd maybe find in more northern climates in central northern Wisconsin area. So you need someone who can focus and think about a variety of habitats simultaneously, and then also what kind of methods of control to use on different species that might be invasive in those habitats. And there's a lot of an important thing to realize with a site like this is it's not just like, oh, I'm in the dune and now I'm in the bluff. There's a lot of hazy. It's a very nebulous boundary, and you get overlap, and you get so it's even that much more important to be flexible and have a full knowledge of the plant communities you are in, and also what kind of invasives you might encounter. And
I know you guys are hiring a lot, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But if somebody is listening to this and wants to maybe get involved in this work, how would you recommend they get started? What sort of, do they just pick up a shovel and come in and say, hey, can I do some grunt work, or do they have to go to school first? How do they get into this?
You can definitely go to school first. It's not a necessity though. I've been working in restoration for about 10 years, and I think some of the best technicians and people who've moved on to other things have come from unconventional backgrounds. I myself, I studied anthropology in college, which can definitely be applied to restoration, but it's really not the science you'd expect someone to go into this field. But it really does apply. And I mean, I think that sometimes it's better to hire people with unconventional backgrounds just as much as it is to get people with conventional backgrounds. I'm the type of manager, I like a mixed group of people with different perspectives. It's more effective. So to answer your question, I mean, you definitely don't need to go to school for it, but it does help. If you want to advance your career to a certain point, it's going to help you, get up into more upper management and administrative positions that will require a lot of technical expertise.
And what is it that drew you into this? You start out, you're studying people, and then you move into working with plants. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
So yeah, definitely. And when you realize, the history of the plant communities around here, they were intimately intertwined with the native peoples that lived here. They were essentially agroforestry communities here, and they would burn to clear the areas for hunting. They'd harvest acorns, so people were actively living and using the plant community as part of their life. So it's always been people, I mean, at least for the last 10,000 years or something, or 20,000, I don't know what they think now. So people have always been intimately intertwined with these communities.
Just to clarify, the communities he's referring to are communities of plants as well as people. It's a kind of thing that Michael Pollan wrote about in his excellent book, The Botany of Desire, A Plant's Eye View of the World. And guess what? That book also has a great audiobook which you can get for free while helping me produce more episodes of Bionic Planet by getting a 30-day trial to Audible through audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet. That's Bionic Planet as a single word with no dots, dashes, or spaces. If you're already a member of Audible but like the work I'm doing and want to help me do more of it, you can give me a good 5-star review on whichever podcatcher you access me through. Or you can become a patron at bionic-planet.com, where you can support me for as little as $1 per episode, either via bionic-planet.com or via patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Finally, you can help just by accessing me through the right podcatcher. Namely, access me through the Radio Public app. That's Radio Public, like public radio but backwards. They automatically pay me a few cents for every listener who hears the show all the way to the end, and that adds up.
You know, humans are part of nature, and we still are. We like to think we're not, but we really are, and we're directly impacting all these communities still. So that drew me into it, but also just doing I did some summer jobs in restoration, and they were, really hard, strenuous jobs, 4 months long, but it really captured my interest, and I started learning about the plants, and then you can really develop an interest, and it just feeds itself. Like every day you learn more when you're working, and you always will. You're never going to know it all, and it's a beautiful thing.
And so now you're hiring people, which is great. I think you said, let's see, you've got 25 employees. You're adding 9 to 12 more, so business is good. Where's the money coming from?
It's really a growing industry, literally and figuratively, but people are getting more and more interested in doing what we consider the right thing, is using native species in their landscaping, whether it's a small backyard or a large corporate campus. I think the forest preserves were already on board, but when it comes to private properties, I think there's a lot more interest now just because of the publicity of it, and there's a lot of clubs and groups that are forming around pollinators and around native plants, and it's just a growing movement. So we're seeing that in the business end of it.
I spent a lot of time in the suburbs this last year. I was canvassing in the lead up to the election, so I got to go out into the suburbs, and it was really interesting to see a lot of areas that looked like they were newly restored habitat. So this isn't just my imagination. I didn't know if it was because I've now learned about it and am more aware of it, or if it really is a growing thing then. Would you want to talk to that, or is that
Yeah, like I said, it's a growing trend, and there are conservation communities that are popping up. Whole communities, homeowners associations that are really taking hold of the concept of using native plants and utilizing their ecosystem services that they provide in managing stormwater and all the other things that they can provide for animals and insects and birds and wildlife. And then, there's quite a few organizations that are promoting this at a homeowner level too. So you'll see more and more of these signs in yards, whether it's Conservation at Home or it's the National Wildlife Federation signs. There's just more interest in it, and people are proud of what they're doing.
And now, did you start the business? You're the founder, or?
I've been with Conservation Land Stewardship for less than a year. My background is in wildlife management, so I worked for the state of Wisconsin for a dozen years. I worked for the National Wild Turkey Federation for a dozen years. I worked for some other nonprofits and other state agencies for a while. So, yeah, and I landed here kind of by happy accident in Illinois to get married.
Congratulations, yeah. Now, I know this company was founded in 1999, and neither of you were there at the start, but Joe, you've been with CLS the longest of the two of you. How's the business changed since you got involved?
Typically you go to a bid now, and there's there are going to be up to 15 to 20 different companies bidding, when back in the day, when Ken started out, CLS, there was maybe four, so it's kind of interesting.
And you mentioned earlier that CLS had gotten purchased by another.
Conservation Land Stewardship is a subsidiary of the Devi Tree Company. We're part of what's called the Devi Resource Group, and that's more of the environmental consulting branch of it. So there's been quite a few acquisitions around the country of different companies that are under that Devi umbrella. There are, I think, 9,000 employees, 10,000 employees nationwide or internationally, and they're poised to be $1 billion company this year. But we still maintain that small company, small town feel, because we kept the name.
We still have our original upper managers, too, in place. So the guys who built the company are still with us and still growing the company.
I did some digging and learned a bit about Devi Resource Group. It's a pretty interesting operation. The company was founded in 1880 as the Devi Tree Expert Company by a self-taught forester from England named John Devi. His son, Martin Devi, went on to become governor of Ohio. And the company has been employee-owned since 1979. Maybe that's why they seem to be treating their people right. Treat people right, and they'll treat you right. And I'm that way too. I hope you like the show and find it helpful. And if you do, you can treat me right and help me produce more episodes by giving me a good 5-star review on whichever podcatcher you access me through. Or you can become a patron at bionic-planet.com, where you can support me for as little as $1 per episode, either via bionic-planet.com or via patreon.com/bionicplanet. Finally, you can help just by accessing me through the right podcatcher. Namely, access me through the Radio Public app. That's Radio Public, like public radio, but backwards. They automatically pay me a few cents for every listener who hears the show to the end, and that adds up.
Yeah, as far as the bee issue goes, all the groups that I mentioned earlier were trying to address that through native plants. The native bees, there's about 4,000 different native bees that rely on native plants. And they evolve together. They've timed their life cycles together to provide pollen, nectar at the right time in the lives of these bees. So, using native plants versus a cultivated variety or a non-native plant that came from somewhere else in the world that's just not timed correctly or doesn't provide the amount or volume or quality of pollen and nectar that our natives need, it can do harm to them because they're wasting energy trying to collect this when it's not there. Another issue with the native bees is actually honeybees, which is a non-native. It's basically livestock, and they can outcompete native bees, and they can carry some diseases and parasites too that affect our native bees.
I've never heard honeybees described as livestock before. But I've heard a lot about colony collapse disorder, which you've probably heard of too. That's the technical term for this global collapse in the population of bees. When the U.S. Department of Agriculture began tracking hives in 1947, there were 5.9 million colonies of bees. In 2008, that number had plunged to 2.4 million. Now, they have bounced back a bit, but they're still more than 50% lower than they were in 1947. The thing is, bees aren't the only pollinators that are dying off. We're also losing bats, butterflies, and hummingbirds. A lot of it's a mystery, and some groups have blamed industrial pesticides, while others have blamed genetically modified organisms. Though I have to say I'm skeptical of that last one. I did some digging on this native plant aspect, and it turns out that scientists have been warning about it for decades. It's the rest of us who've been slow to pick up on that connection. Fortunately, that's changing, and policymakers are now encouraging development that favors pollinators, which Nye says translates into a business opportunity.
A new emerging industry is the community solar, where you see the larger field arrays that a community can tap into, and residents can decide where their energy comes from. They let the power company know which source they want to pay for. And recently, Illinois and some surrounding states have passed some legislation that will allow for the certification of sites as pollinator friendly. And they've created checklists or a cookbook basically that can be followed. So when a solar developer meets all the criteria, they can be certified as pollinator friendly. And I think that helps them a lot in finding sites. It's more appealing to the community. So they'd be more willing to start out with a community solar site. And, this is right up our alley. This is what we do. We plant natives and maintain them.
I assume there are other plants and animals that have evolved along with these plants too. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, not only bees, but other pollinators too, like butterflies and moths. Not only they're needing the nectar and pollen, but their larvae need host plants to eat. And some of them are very specific. We all know monarch requires milkweed, but there's a lot of others that are host specific too. Comparing native plants to non-native plants, in, let's say, North America, a native oak tree is going to provide food for the larva or adult insects of over 400 species. Whereas if you took something not from this country, like a ginkgo tree, which is Asian, that will provide food for potentially 3-4 species of insects, of native insects. So, it just goes to show that the coevolution of these species is really important to consider when you're choosing plants for just a landscape or for a larger area.
Yeah, and another thing too that's important to realize too is like for birds, like they we have a misconception that they mostly eat like fruit, but they really mostly eat insects. So that's another reason these native insects are so important, is to support like bird populations as well and up the food chain.
And 95% of our birds feed their young insects.
We're all one big ecosystem. I depend on you, my listeners, for support, and you hopefully get something too. If you like what you're getting and want more, you know what you can do, but I'm going to repeat it anyway. First, you can give me a big, fat, healthy review on whichever podcatcher you access me through. That matters because the more reviews I get, the more ears I get. And the more ears I get, the more minds I can reach. And we have to reach hundreds of millions of minds if we're to meet this climate challenge. Second, you can become a patron at bionic-planet.com, where you can support me for as little as $1 per episode, either via bionic-planet.com or via patreon.com/bionicplanet. And you can do so with a monthly cap. So you can do $1 per episode with a $5 monthly cap, and you'll never pay more than $5. Third, you can access Bionic Planet through the right podcatcher. Namely, access me through the Radio Public app. That's Radio Public, like public radio but backwards. They automatically pay me a few cents for every listener who hears the show all the way to the end, and that adds up. Fourth, you can buy stuff on Amazon by clicking through to Amazon from my own website, bionic-planet.com. And finally, you can join Audible by going to audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet. And that brings me to my final question, and it's one I think I'm going to start asking every guest from here on in. After Joe and I had a chat about the book 1491, I turned the recorder back on and asked Dave if there were any books he'd like to recommend.
One of my favorite books is by Benjamin Vogt, V-O-G-T is his name, and the book is A New Garden Ethic. He has a lot of his own philosophies, but he's borrowed a lot of philosophies from Aldo Leopold, and then from a contemporary, Doug Ptolemy, who's an entomologist from the East Coast.
A good thing about these books that Dave's recommending, I stand by too. I think one of the best points about it is that you don't need a lot to make a big difference. That's the point of them. Like you can make a garden the size of this couch, and I know I've seen remnant native areas that in an area this big, there's dozens of species. So you can really do a lot with a small area. If you just have a garden on your porch or whatever, you'll plant an aster in your backyard, a rare aster or something that you don't commonly see on a roadside. And somehow, within, when it's blooming, these insects find their way. It's crazy. I know there's studies going on now about electrical and chemical signaling that actually goes on with some of these plants. And it's just insane how they can find these beacons. So that's how I know, and I know you're probably not going to get like threatened and endangered species necessarily, but your generalists and insects that might be in a nearby hedgerow or something surviving, they'll find it. It's really remarkable.
Joe Krischon of the Conservation Land Stewardship, or CLS, closing out this edition of Bionic Planet. I recorded that interview in Chicago, but I'm recording the wraparound here in Washington, D.C., where I'll be attending the Ecological Restoration Business Association, or ERBA's annual policy meeting on behalf of Ecosystem Marketplace. I hope to have some good stuff for you from here, and I promise I will have some good stuff on Ecosystem Marketplace. That's Ecosystem Marketplace, all one word, ecosystemmarketplace.com, which is my full-time gig. Until next time, I'm Steve Zwick in Washington, D.C. Thanks for listening.